Welcome. Grab your favorite morning beverage and join us for Morning Cannolis with Jim Santel.
You don't know me, but I'm your brother.
Sampling the news desserts of the week, here is your host, Jim Santel.
Good morning. It is Saturday, January 14th, 2023. Welcome to Morning Cannolis. This is, as always, our weekend review of those important stories in law, in government, and the aspiration for justice in America. Thank you so much for once again joining me this hour and hopefully next hour too, as we discuss some of those major issues that have populated the headlines, populated the news focus here in America, and today also beyond the borders of America with respect to one story all about law, government, and justice in America. Delighted to have you with me this morning. I'm also here in the studios of WAUK Radio with my wonderful producer. His name is Calvin, and together we're also taking your phone calls this hour and next. That number, as you know, is 844-967-2789. Once again, 844-967-2789. Always delighted to get your thoughtful comments, your insightful questions, your perspectives on the things that we talk about, sometimes the things that are not on our agenda. Welcome all of that. This is our 30th broadcast, Morning Cannolis, beginning way back in June of last year. Again, delighted to have you join me this morning as you have in the past. Hopefully we'll continue to do so. This a broadcast of civic media. It is significant along the way to say that something big is happening on Thursday, January 26th. All of the stations, the affiliated places of civic media. The leadership of civic media offering to advertisers, local and statewide, about $1 million in free advertising right here on WAUK and all of the other stations of civic media. Take a look at the website on that. Take a look at the wonderful offering being made here. Free advertising, up to $1 million, $5,000 chunks to advertisers who might be interested in becoming a part of the civic media family through that advertising opportunity. Today, as I said, we have, as always, an ambitious but achievable, informative, and perhaps even inspiring and engaging agenda, a good academic syllabus for us to discuss many, many things during the course of this hour and also next. Before we begin that movement through all of those important stories in law, government, and the rule of law here in America, let's do as we always do, a little bit of a look back, things that happened in history on this day, January 14th. Today, only three, at least two of them related to the law and the aspiration for justice in our nation. It was way back in 1942, January 14th, that a very reluctant but nonetheless resigned president of the United States, his name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, signed something called the War Department's Executive Order 9066. You may not recognize that. I suspect you don't, and that's okay because it's more formally known as the Japanese Internment Directive, the executive order that authorized the physical removal of all Japanese Americans into internment camps in America. That happened today, 1942, January 14th. A blot, undeniably, on our American history, followed up by a decision in 1944, a couple of years later, when that was challenged by some citizens of Japanese descent, Americans of Japanese descent, a case that went to the United States Supreme Court, ultimately a case called Korematsu decided in 1944. A majority of the Supreme Court in 1944 said that that was all right. They supported the taking, the removal, the placement of Japanese American citizens in internment camps during the course of World War II. Again, justified inappropriately on the basis that Japanese Americans, citizens of our nation, would somehow not be having allegiance to our nation. Plainly not true. That upholding of the exclusion of Japanese Americans into those internment camps stood as a law. It was criticized roundly, resolutely, and today is regarded as one of the great blots also on Supreme Court history. And indeed, in 2018, even though we'd like to think that long before that, the Supreme Court would not follow up on that kind of precedent and order the internment of any citizens, of the United States based upon their heritage. We embrace heritage, right? We encourage nationality, race, all those other immutable characteristics that make us a wonderfully diverse nation. Nonetheless, in 2018, John Roberts used the opportunity of a majority opinion in a case called Trump versus Hawaii to explicitly repudiate, to send back that notion set forth in Korematsu that it is okay for the government to do what the president and the War Department did at that time. Today, we know that as the Defense Department, at that time, executing this Executive Order 9066, a blot on our nation's history, a blot on Supreme Court history, thankfully repudiated not too long ago, and again, for many, many years, academically also rejected by everyone who looked at this shortly after not only World War II, but even after the issuance of the opinion itself. That happened today in 1942. 1981, jumping a little bit more currently, was the day that the Iran hostage crisis ended. It began in 1979. 60 people held initially, as many of you may recall, at the embassy in Tehran. 52 of them for a total of 444 days, ultimately released by the Ayatollah just as Jimmy Carter was leaving office and Ronald Reagan was taking the presidency. It ended today, January 14th, 1981. And the other big news of the past, January 14th, it was today in 1963 that Alabama, Georgia Governor George Wallace, he was the 45th governor of the state of Alabama, was first sworn in. He would serve 4 terms in that major significant position in the state of Alabama. He ran many times for the presidency of the United States of America, took on Lyndon Johnson unsuccessfully. Also later on ran an independent campaign for the presidency, none of those successful. The significance of George Wallace in history, not only one of the longest serving governors in United States history, probably the 3rd longest in all of our history. George Wallace, also a blot on our nation's history. His motto, segregation forever. He spent most of his career talking about race, identifying the people of color, people of non-white populations in America as being not entitled to all of the rights and privileges guaranteed by the Constitution and the laws of the states, the laws of the United States of America, and that all of us would embrace today. Nonetheless, elected repeatedly after 1963 into that position, and his legacy remains to this day one of racism, promoting the Jim Crow laws and otherwise encouraging people to believe that somehow people of color are not entitled to the benefits and the privileges of society in America, including education, health care, all those other things that are important to our life and livelihood. 1963, the first time that George Wallace took the oath of office in Alabama, serving then for 3 additional terms later on in our nation's history. Let's now turn to current history, current events in America. Let's talk a little bit about our syllabus this morning, both this hour and also next hour here on Morning Cannolis. We've got lots and lots of things to talk about. We're not going to spend a lot of time, if any, talking about what happened in Congress this past week, although we plainly could, highlighting instead some of the secondary issues, but beginning with 2 major issues that did in fact populate our newspapers and our media feeds throughout this week. One, of course, the discovery of classified documents in Joe Biden's, our president's, both his office in Washington, D.C., and also his residence in Delaware, his office that he had during the time that he was not in office. The disclosure of those discoveries actually made in late 2022. Disclosures made of those just this past week. We're going to talk about those classified documents, what they mean, what we know, what we don't know up to this point, and why they are significant, why it's important to understand both what we know about this case, why it is different, why it's the same to the other investigations also being pursued, as we know well, with respect to classified documents taken from the White House by former President Trump. We're going to talk a lot about that in our first hour this morning. We're also going to talk about the other major rule of law issue from this past week, and that is the sentencing by a state court judge in New York of the Trump Corporation and its chief financial officer fellow we've talked about a lot on this broadcast and others here on the stations of civic media, a fellow named Alan Weisselberg, both of them sentenced, given criminal sentences this past week, bringing at least this portion of that investigation and prosecution to an end in Manhattan. We're going to chat somewhat about that. Again, taking your phone calls. Other things on our agenda this morning, we're going to revisit Jean Carroll back in the news again this past week, as you know well, and we're going to talk about it again this morning. Two lawsuits challenging the former president in his statements that he did not, in fact, assault her. Statements he made contrary to Jean Carroll's clear exposition, her claims that he, in fact, attempted to sexually assault her in the 1990s in a store in Manhattan. We're going to talk about a transcript that was released just this past week that gives us more insight into the dynamics of those two lawsuits that remain pending in New York. We're also going to talk about another Trump-related matter, and that is Rudy Giuliani and the subpoena that was issued to him way back in November, just disclosed this past week, again, by the Department of Justice, by the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Columbia. We'll talk about the focus of that subpoena issued to Rudy Giuliani, obviously a former chief officer of the Trump entities, if you will, a principal aide, a guider, an advisor to the former president. And we're going to talk about what that subpoena means and its significance when it comes to the overall investigations going on with respect to the former president. And then we're also going to chat a lot about the Proud Boys and the trial that was suspended this week for a number of different reasons. Not to say that there wasn't some significant news coming out of the federal court in the District of Columbia. Those Proud Boys, again, on trial for seditious conspiracy. We're going to talk about what happened this past week in that area. Second hour, assuming we get through all of that in the first hour, we're going to return again to the Supreme Court of the United States of America. We're going to talk about a New York guns law. We're going to talk about a particular case that was dismissed and supported by the Supreme Court that was challenging the Biden presidency. We're going to talk about some new cases taken up by the Supreme Court, 8 new cases, including an employment case. We're also going to talk along the way about a case outside of the United States of America involving the new and former president of Brazil, Bolsonaro. Continue to join us this morning for all of that right after the break here on Morning Cannolis. We are back. Thank you once again for staying with me. Our weekend review of the big stories in law, government, and aspiration for justice in America. My name is Jim Santel. We're talking this morning about a number of major issues. At the top of our agenda, our syllabus this morning, the Biden documents case. Once again, the disclosure this past week that the current president had in his possession during the time that he was out of office. This is a time period after he served as the vice president under President Obama, in his office, both in Washington, D.C., and also his private residence in Delaware, some classified documents. Again, plainly shades of, important to emphasize, shades of what we've seen already with respect to the former president, Donald Trump, and the documents case that is still under investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice under Jack Smith, who's the special counsel there. Let's talk about what we know. And again, the reason for this is to identify what we do know, but also to draw some distinctions between the Trump case and what we know already about the Biden case as well. This past Thursday, Merrick Garland and the White House provided us with a little bit better sense of the timing of the disclosure, the discovery of these documents in these two locations. We know now that way back in November 2nd, Joe Biden's lawyers discovered what they described as a small number of classified documents in what was described as a closed, a locked closet in an office that Mr. Biden had used. Something called the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. It's an office established by the University of Pennsylvania and also plainly staffed by the then former vice president, now president, as a part of a think tank in Washington, D.C. A small number of classified documents found in this locked closet in that location. The following day, the National Archives, NARA, we've talked about them a lot, retrieved those materials from the closet. And the day after that, the archives referred this matter to the Department of Justice. November 14th, about 10 days after that, the Attorney General selected a fellow named John Lausch, who is the U.S. Attorney in Chicago. He was a Trump appointee, has remained in that office to conduct a preliminary assessment of that material, to determine what we should do about that, to make a recommendation about what should happen inside the Department of Justice. December 20th, the current president's lawyers told Mr. Lausch, the U.S. Attorney in Chicago, that they had found a second set of classified documents in the garage in Joe Biden's house in Wilmington, Delaware. And that, again, according to the Attorney General disclosing that this past week. The administration separately said it immediately notified the Justice Department again upon finding this additional small number of files in a storage space in a garage and a single-page document in an adjacent room. On January 5th, the U.S. Attorney in Chicago advised the Attorney General that a special counsel, from his perspective, was warranted. And on January 9th, CBS News first reported on the existence of these documents found at the Penn Biden Center just this past week. The White House acknowledging that in a statement. January 10th, the president told reporters when he was in Mexico City visiting the president there that he was surprised to learn in the fall that there were classified documents that had been taken to his former office at that think tank, but he did not disclose that additional documents had been taken. The following day, we had a report that the second batch of classified records had been found without details specifically about when and where. And that was, of course, the batch was found in the garage on December 20th. And again, on January 12th, just this past week, the White House acknowledged that documents had been found in that garage. A search of the Biden home in Rehoboth, Delaware, did not recover any further documents, the administration and the Department of Justice had said. Along the way, however, the Attorney General decided, taking up the recommendation made by the U.S. Attorney Lausch out of Chicago, to appoint a special counsel to review this matter. And indeed, the Attorney General did that just this past week. He appointed a fellow named Robert Hur, H-U-R. He's a former U.S. Attorney in Maryland, again, coming in out of private practice now. Mr. Hur was a litigation partner at a law firm called Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. But before that, he had been the U.S. Attorney in Maryland under the Trump administration, nominated by the former president, confirmed by the Senate, served in that capacity throughout the Trump administration. Mr. Hur, a graduate of the Stanford Law School, Harvard College, served as one of the top aides of someone who many of you will recall. Remember, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein actually was a colleague of mine during the Biden administration. He was the U.S. Attorney in Maryland. Rod Rosenstein then went on to be the Deputy Attorney General, and during that term, Mr. Hur served as one of his top aides in the Deputy Attorney General's office. Hur had also previously, a long time ago, served as a law clerk for Supreme Court Chief Justice William Rehnquist. So that is his background. That is his history. He plainly now serves as a bookend, if you will, to the related, but again, I'm going to offer quite different investigation being pursued by the other special counsel, and his name is Jack Smith, also appointed by the Attorney General to review what? To review the Mar-a-Lago documents that have been taken by the former president to the Mar-a-Lago location, Donald Trump taking those. A major difference is just this, and the reason why I went through all of this history is just this. The disclosure, the identification by these documents by the lawyers for the current president, former vice president, immediately turning them over, recognizing they shouldn't be there, recognizing this is a problem, turning them over immediately to the Department of Justice, ultimately through NARA, making that disclosure. Why is that important? It shows a recognition of the significance of those documents. It shows the notion that probably this was very sloppy, maybe even negligent, and wrong to have them, but disclosure made immediately. Compare that, as we have spoken on this broadcast in great detail, to the difficulty undertaken by the NARA in getting documents back from the former President Trump, requests made by the archives when they discovered that they did not have everything that they should have, requests made, a grand jury subpoena issued, ultimately a search warrant also to get those documents back. We're going to talk more about that and also take at least one caller. who's already calling in about this or perhaps another topic right after the break as we're here on Morning Cannolis chatting about, again, the appointment of a new special counsel just this past week in America. Stay with us. We are talking this morning, January 14th, about one of the major news stories of this past week, the disclosure that the current president, formerly vice president, had in his possession both at his home in Delaware and also in his now former office in Washington, D.C., some classified documents. Getting to do some analysis of that. And we begin, as I indicated right before the break, with the fundamental notion that no one is above the law. No one is above the law. The Attorney General right to open up a new file on this, to direct that investigation be undertaken, because we don't know whether or not there was a criminal intent here, a criminal case here can be made. I'm going to talk about that in just a moment or so. So very important for everyone to understand, Republicans, Democrats, everyone in between, independents, no one is above the law. We always say that, and appropriate to investigate to find out what the facts are. What do we want to find out? The same kinds of things, treating this matter the same in many ways as one would start at least treating the Trump matter. What are these documents? How many of them? Plainly, many fewer than involved in the Trump matter. Thousands of documents there, at least 100 of them classified. Here you've got a much less voluminous number of documents. You want to figure out what those documents said. Presumably fairly easy to determine looking at their substance. And most importantly, you want to figure out how they got there, right? How did they end up there? Pure negligence? Was this inadvertent, as it certainly suggests that it was already? Or was this intentional? Was there some purpose in taking the documents, putting them where they were? The same questions get asked in the same equitable treatment of anyone who might be under investigation. And I say that at the outset just because it's important to establish again, as this president, as this attorney general has said, no one above the law. And the investigation now goes forward to determine that all-important issue of intent. And again, as we have spoken on so many occasions on this broadcast and others, that's the linchpin of every single criminal investigation. Bad things happen in America. Bad things happen in life. Sometimes those are catastrophic. In order for a criminal prosecution to take hold, to have some vitality, in order for a grand jury to return an indictment, for prosecutors, state prosecutors, federal prosecutors to return charges, you have to have established intent, purpose, knowledge. I intended to engage in this criminal conduct, and absent that, you don't have a case. And so that will certainly be the focus of Jack Smith's continuing inquiry. It already is the focus, to be sure, to figure out what Donald Trump meant, what he intended when he took those documents, how was he using them, and what kinds of things, what are the indicia that intent may have been there. The case in that instance involving the former president plainly involves, as I said before the break, these numerous attempts to try to get those documents back. And why is that significant? And why is it different from the Biden matter? Repeated attempts providing notice, right? Providing information, providing advice, if you will, to the former president that you shouldn't have these documents. We need them back. And when you refuse or for whatever reason decline to produce them in response to requests, in response to a grand jury, a subpoena, finally producing them in the wake of a search warrant and still not having everything, the intent is perhaps clearer than it would be if you simply discover them and turn them over right away, which is much closer, as far as we know, to the Biden circumstance. And so we will see what these two special counsels, looking at the same kind of thing generically, but approaching this plainly on a very, very different factual predicate, different kinds of cases, important for us to understand, even though we do not have all the facts yet on the Biden matter, we do not have all the facts on the Trump matter either. But it is perhaps too early to say what will happen. My own sense is highly unlikely that there is a viable criminal prosecution with respect to Joe Biden and the discovery of these documents in his former office, in his home. Why? Again, because discovery and turnover suggests a recognition and a lack of intent to take them and to keep them, a discovery that this was a mistake. We don't in America charge people for criminal conduct based upon negligence. That's a civil matter. And so we'll talk more about that. Plainly, much in the news this past week, much more coming out, and we will see what happens coming out of the Department of Justice. Jack Smith on the one hand, and then also Robert Hurd on the other, two special counsels looking at whether or not the acquisition, the taking, the possession of these documents by a former president and now our current president, while he was the vice president and right after that, whether there was any criminal exposure there. No one above the law. We've got on the line Dick. Dick, appreciate your calling in this morning. Thanks for being a part of our show this morning.
Couple questions. Is there an assistant attorney general besides Merrick Garland?
Yes, there are actually many assistant attorneys general.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
And the reason I asked the question is because let's say that Jack Smith, and then I got one about the other special counsel.
Right.
Let's say he comes with just the mother load. I mean, a slam dunk on Trump. I'm afraid that Merrick Garland will want to pass the ball, or maybe should, because he seems like that's all he can do, in my mind, is pass the ball to somebody else, saying it's too political, when, anything about a former president being indicted and maybe going to trial would be political. But secondly, is it Hurd or her?
Hurd, right, exactly, right.
What do you...
Her.
Before you say I'm a conspiracy theorist, you remember what Trump did with the Attorney General in the state of Georgia and with President Zelensky? What do you think the over and under is that this clown will try and make contact with Mr. Hurd?
Right.
I'm talking about Trump.
Right, sure. To the new special counsel, Robert Hur, exactly. We don't know. But plainly, this president, the former president, that is out there already, Dick, as you've just said, commenting not only, even this past week, on Jack Smith, suggesting that his investigation is inappropriate, not just ill-timed, but unsubstantiated. And now, of course, indicating that Robert Hur and the special counsel investigation that he is pursuing should, in fact, be pursued actively, and that this is a crime. And so who knows what our former president will do. We certainly hope that he will not attempt to do anything to affect that investigation. My strong guess is Robert Hur appreciates that he doesn't take any phone calls, doesn't take any communications from anyone who is the subject or a target of the investigation. Same with Jack Smith. Should not be hearing from and should not have any contact with Donald Trump. May eventually want to offer those folks opportunities to discuss what they know. But again, basic fundamental tenets there. To respond to your earlier issue about the Attorney General himself, the Attorney General does have a Deputy Attorney General. Her name is Lisa Monaco. She is plainly second in command there. There are many assistant attorneys general as well, and they are in charge of things like the Criminal Division, the National Security Division, the Antitrust Division, the Environmental Natural Resources Division, the Tax Division, all of them responsible for various areas, the Civil Division as well, all of them responsible for particular assignments given the United States Department of Justice. All of those people eventually are responsible to and are supervised by the Attorney General. Ultimately, and I think, Dick, this is implicit in your concern about Merrick Garland, whether it is a recommendation from Jack Smith, a recommendation from Robert Hur in these two separate, but again, rule of law related cases, ultimately, it is the Attorney General himself who will have to make the decision about charges. And even if their assistant attorneys general, even if Lisa Monaco as the deputy makes recommendations, they are just that. Ultimately, it is the Attorney General who makes the determination on all of these cases. And so to that point, as I've said in other settings on this broadcast and others, this notion that the special counsel are truly independent and have a completely independent prerogative and judgment base, they can pursue this, but ultimately their decision is not only subject to, but has to be made by the Attorney General. And they will be making recommendations to the Attorney General and perhaps other assistant attorneys general about what should happen here. Ultimately, it still comes back to Merrick Garland And so this notion that somehow there is a completely independent Department of Justice led by these two special counsels, that is not accurate as a practical matter. And again, as a part of our civics education here, as we do every Saturday morning, that important to know as well. Dick, very much appreciate the comment and the question about all of this. Also getting into a little structure related to the Department of Justice. Important to know, important to understand as we try to figure out what's going on here. Again, no one above the law. Rule of law applies to everyone. And that plainly is what the Attorney General has said, including other Assistant Attorneys General and the Deputy as well. Bill from Oconomowoc, you're also calling in this morning. Glad to have you with us this morning, Bill.
Thank you very much for the job you do. You're quite an educator. I've got something to share, two things to share with you. One is I think the greatest thing that ever happened was Biden having to turn in these documents. It's going to set the bar for honesty, integrity,
Sure.
The whole 9 yards of carrying the office of president. One is going to mirror what, okay, it happened, but he dealt with it. The other one is running from it, denying it,
Right.
lying about
Right.
it, stonewalling. And last but not least, the Trump people say, oh, you've always been out to get Trump. I never wanted that man to even run for president. If you looked at his personal resume from the 11 bankruptcies, what's going on in Scotland, and then the alleged, not charged, 26 sexual assaults, do you want a man like that to even be president? Of course people didn't want him in office.
Right.
It stands to reason. He lacks integrity, he lacks honesty, and he can't comprehend diplomacy. So thanks so much for what you do, and have a great day.
Bill, appreciate the comment very much. We're actually going to feed that thought a little bit more in our next stories. We're going to talk more about the problems that the former President Donald Trump is facing, both in the criminal arena, but also in the civil arena. Some of his senior aides, like Rudy Giuliani, other things out there in the coming minutes here this morning. But as to your very first point, hugely important to make that point, Bill. I appreciate the comment that intent and determination about whether or not there's a criminal case is all based upon an assessment of conduct, right? If I discover that I have something in my possession that I shouldn't have, and I immediately run to the authorities and say, I shouldn't have this, it certainly suggests that I did not have the intent, the criminal intent, that I made a mistake, right? And you're absolutely right from my perspective, and I think the perspective of everybody looking at this, most people, perhaps not everyone, but most rational, reasonable people looking at this saying, you know what? Discovery is made. Honesty, integrity, Bill, exactly as you described it, says that this is what you do. And not only because that will also show that you don't have the criminal intent to have taken these documents in the first place, to keep them, to use them for some nefarious purpose, but beyond that, and Bill, I think this is right at the core of what you're saying, it is the right thing to do, right? And we expect our presidents to be upright with us. When bad things happen, we want them to tell us about those things. We want them to tell us about the things that they themselves have done. And that makes us trust them more when it comes to the difficult things and, yes, even the easy things that are out there for us to understand. So great comments. Bill, appreciate that very much. Dick, as well, your comments this morning about this. We will continue to monitor this as well. We also have another major issue coming right off of Bill's comment about the integrity and the background, if you will, the history of Donald Trump. And Bill obviously opposed not only to his first election as president, but also any future opportunity. We know the former president has announced that he is a candidate in 2024 to resume the presidency in the White House. This past week, another major story, this one coming out of New York. We recall that not too long ago, the Trump Corporation and its chief financial officer both found criminally guilty, felony tax fraud counts and other financial charges in the Manhattan State Court, a New York charge brought by Alvin Bragg, who is the district attorney for Manhattan. Alvin Bragg, again, responsible, taking over from the prior attorney, the district attorney in Manhattan. This past week, former President Donald Trump's family real estate business, the Trump Corporation, ordered just yesterday to pay a $1.6 million criminal penalty based upon its prior conviction in this felony tax fraud case. Also, we know just this past week, that Alan Weisselberg, this is a chief financial officer, sentenced to 5 months in prison. He's going to Rikers Island, the jail complex there in New York. We're going to talk more about the reason why that is also a major story in the rule of law this week. We're going to talk more about that when we come back. Stay with us to chat about this and other issues.
I'm grooving, and we're cruising, and I'm cruising with my baby. I'm grooving, and I'm cruising with my baby.
We are back, and we are talking in these final moments of our first segment here at Morning Cannolis about this very significant sentence imposed on the Trump company and also upon its CFO, Alan Weisselberg, by a Manhattan judge. His name is Juan Merchan, Merchan, just this past week. Again, a $1.6 million criminal penalty and 5 months in state prison for Alan Weisselberg as a result of this criminal prosecution, resulting in a criminal conviction back in December, basically for doling out off-the-books perks, some of the top executives engaging in tax fraud under New York state law. Significantly, the district attorney, Alvin Bragg, called in a statement for the state to change the law so that we can impose, as he said, more significant penalties and sanctions on corporations that commit crimes in New York, plainly responding there to an awful lot of the response out there that says, gosh, $1.6 million, probably a drop in the bucket. Sounds a lot like a lot of money to me, and I suspect to most, if not all of you as well. But $1.6 million in this multi-million, if not billion-dollar set of companies and corporations that are the Trump entities. And Alvin Bragg recognizing that. The Judge Merchan, saying as well that the evidence compelled him to impose this penalty. That is the maximum, the highest amount he could impose. Plainly, you can't jail, you can't imprison a corporation. You can do so with a chief financial officer, and Alan Weisselberg, who testified in that trial on behalf of the prosecution, now going to prison for his involvement. What is the other significance of this? The question, of course, is what about Donald Trump himself? Following up on our good callers just before the break, it is clear that this matter has been focusing not only upon the corporation, but on the players themselves. And reasonably clear that Mr. Bragg's prosecutors continue to scrutinize all of these activities to determine what the former president's role, what Donald Trump's role was in the payment of these kinds of perks, these tax fraud engagements, and specifically an awful lot of information to suggest that the DA's office there is still looking at this role of the former president in this hush money paid to a porn star who said she had an affair with the now former president. Again, that according to people who are somewhat familiar with this matter. Also conducting, presumably, a broader examination of Mr. Trump's business practices of the past, maybe of the present as well, and whether he fraudulently inflated the value of certain assets. And in that connection, also important to note, not just as a footnote, but as an important thing to understand that, again, also in New York, Donald Trump is facing the civil litigation brought by the state attorney general, not the DA, the state attorney general. Her name, again, Letitia James. She is seeking $250 million against Trump companies, seeking to bar the Trumps, including Donald and his children, from ever serving on boards again, based upon their improper, their illegal, their inconsistent valuation of properties. So she's also looking at valuation issues, financial issues, monetary issues as a part of the civil litigation going on there. The former president having already provided a deposition testimony compelled by the court that's overseeing that civil case. That case, again, not yet going to judgment, probably no time soon, but nonetheless proceeding apace under the litigation prerogative and also the push of the attorney general there in the state of New York. Again, many other things. We're going to talk about even more of that, more other civil matters involving the former president in just a moment or so. But again, those two big news stories coming out of just this past week, classified documents and Trump sentencings in Manhattan. Before we got into those other stories, let's take another caller from Joe in Madison. Joe, thrilled to have you back with us again this morning. Your comment or question about this or other matters that are highlighting our news in America.
Thank you so much for all of this information. I think that the issue of intent is a very interesting one, and you alluded to in one of the previous segments the differences between classified documents, Biden, classified documents, Trump. And I think it's a really interesting point, not only to talk about intention, but also to talk about a calendar or timeline, if you will. So as I understand it, upon being notified that there were documents discovered, the Biden legal team, after being told by the National Archives, you guys have some stuff here, go look for them, returned them. And I'm curious if we have kind of a length of time or a timeline or a calendar to contrast Biden's okay, you need them, you want them back, whoops, here you go, as compared to, as you described, the Trump, ex-Trump, President Trump, told to give them back, said no again, which forced the grand jury, which forced the search warrant, and as I understand it, he's still stonewalling on particular documents that have not been returned. What's the length of time that we've been dealing with Trump saying no, as compared to length of time with a Biden? Do you have a sense of that? Can you relate that?
Absolutely. A great question, because, again, it goes to what is the purpose here? Again, as I said before, this notion that how you behave when you discover something that you may have done that's wrong with a small w, how you respond to that speaks all to intent, Joe, as you just indicated, right? So we know that very shortly after President Trump left office, the archives began to look around and say, gee, we're missing things, right? We don't have things that normally would be a part of the presidential archives, and they begin to make first requests. And that's when we get this first box of documents. And Donald Trump does provide some things, and it's in that first batch of documents, plainly not complete, that the NARA and the archives identify some classified materials, and they say that's problematic, and more than that, we still don't have everything. And so, Joe, you've got it just right. In the months that follow, then, after those requests are made, further requests made through NARA, ultimately referred to the Department of Justice, requests made by prosecutors to return these documents, letters issued to the attorneys, and then ultimately going to the grand jury, asking for this grand jury subpoena months later. Ultimately, when still there's not full compliance, going to get a search warrant from the magistrate judge in South Florida, going in with a compelled review and search and seizure of documents there. And again, as you said, even in the wake of that, in the midst of that, representations by attorneys for Donald Trump that you've got everything. And it turns out that those are not true as well. Again, you wonder out loud, and it does go to intent and the purpose, why it is, if you've been provided with notice so early on, a year ago, more than a year since you've been out of office, why do you still have documents? Why don't you do this scouring, as plainly the Biden folks did, and determine whether or not you've got anything more? Contrast that, Joe, as you invited, to what I did earlier, which is to review the timetable, which is very, very short. Between November 2nd, when they first discover these documents, November 3rd, National Archives has them. We make referrals then again to John Lausch. And then once again, in late December, December 20th, there's a second set of materials. Those are produced within days, maybe a week or so afterwards. Again, we recognize we shouldn't have these documents. We turn them over. It speaks hugely, hugely to the intent issue. Appreciate the phone call and the opportunity to discuss that. Very good point, Joe. We'll talk more about that and other matters as we go into our second hour here in our review of Justice in America. Escape, ultimately. In the wake of that, she also published some additional information about that, prompting the president, while he is the president in the White House, not only to deny that this ever happened, again, back in the 1990s, but also saying some fairly scurrilous things about E. Jean Carroll herself, her physical appearance, saying he doesn't know this woman, denying any allegations, and also saying things like, look at her, she's not my type. Things that we would not expect of any president, regardless of allegations made with foundation or not. That prompts E. Jean Carroll, that is these statements that the president, the former president, makes while he's in the White House, to sue him for defamation, basically saying that when you said publicly that I lied about this event back in the 1990s, you're defaming me. You're suggesting to the world that I am lying. And as a result of all sorts of machinations that get into the application of something called the Federal Tort Claims Act and the scope of responsibility for actors in the federal system, including
this is Matt from Design Card.
the President of the United States of America. As a result of all of that, E. Jean Carroll has a lawsuit that, again, pending first in the New York State Court, ultimately removed to the federal court, again, based upon this attempt by the former administration to substitute the United States of America for Donald Trump. Following all of that has to do with civil procedure, civil practice, and the federal law. The upshot of that is that inside that federal case, now pending in federal court, again, partially on appeal to the appeals court on this issue of substitution, while that's going on, the district court judge, the trial judge, says, you know what? I'm going to permit discovery to proceed. I'm going to permit the discovery to include a deposition, an oral deposition of the former president. And that happened on October 19th of this past year. At the time, you may recall, we chatted a little bit about that happening. We didn't have a transcript. This past week, the transcript of that deposition in that initial defamation case was released over the objection of the former president's lawyers, over the objection of Donald Trump, released by the district court judge. And among other things, again, the former president repeats in that deposition, we know it was October 19th, took about 5.5 hours, took place at the former president's Palm Beach residence. He once again denies knowing anything about her. Along the way, says things like, I know nothing about this nut job. Those words from the former president in the deposition of October 19th, goes on to say that, of course, from his view, consistent with his perspective, his statement of denying the allegations that this never happened. And along the way, takes account of the litigation itself. And in a long exchange with the attorney for E. Jean Carroll, who has this opportunity to ask him questions during the course of this deposition, the former president says, this is a false accusation. Never happened, never would happen. I posted, I will continue to post, as he did about 6 days or so before this deposition, denying this once again. He says, I'll continue to post until such time, and then I will sue when this is all over. And that's what I'm really looking forward to doing, the former president said. I'll sue you too, he says to the attorney, because this is, how many cases do you have? He says, many, many cases. And I know that statements were made that you made. Keep Trump busy because this is the way you defeat him, to keep him busy with litigation. So I will be suing you also. I'll be suing her very strongly as soon as this, but I'll be suing you too. Again, making reference to E. Jean Carroll and the attorney. A strong denial, which he has within his rights to do, but nonetheless taking on the attorney and promising more lawsuits in response to this lawsuit by her. The attorney named Kaplan, responds to all that by saying, are you done? And the former president says, yeah. And goes on to say, is there anything in particular that prompted you to make this statement last week? Again, this posting about the continuing denial. And the president says, yeah, her false story, and that I have to waste a whole day doing responding to these ridiculous questions with you. Again, that coming out of the unsealed, again, released document, this transcript of the deposition taken by E. Jean Carroll's attorney of Donald Trump back in October. That case still continues, of course, the release of that document, again, over the former president's objection. But it's also a part of a second piece of litigation that we've also talked about here on this broadcast. We know that in the wake of the filing of that lawsuit, and perhaps in part, but not entirely in response to that, New York passed a law. It's called the New York Adult Survivors Act. Basically, it revives any lawsuits of this type, alleging sexual assault, rape, other things like that, horrendous, heinous crimes like that, if in fact the statute of limitations is run. And plainly, this is an allegation about something that happened back in the 1990s, 27 years or so ago. Plainly, the statute of limitations is run. This New York Adult Survivors Act gives petitioners, gives plaintiffs like E. Jean Carroll and others the opportunity, a limited window, to bring new lawsuits, to bring new charges, to encourage criminal prosecution for these same events under this new law. And she has done just that. And that lawsuit is also pending out there, much related to the same fact pattern as we just described earlier, but nonetheless a parallel lawsuit. Needless to say, the former president's lawyers are attacking the constitutionality of that New York law. We will continue to monitor all of those cases as they continue to go forward civilly and perhaps criminally as well in New York. We've got more. We've got more also focusing upon the former president. And this again goes back to Washington, D.C., goes back to the circle of advisors. I sit at the top of the 2-hour program here this morning that we're going to talk about Rudy Giuliani, and indeed we are. We know well, Rudy Giuliani, former U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, former mayor, sometimes referred to as America's mayor in the wake of 9/11, came to the not only the description of what happened on September 11th, but also rallying, if you will, much of the country around the heroes of that day, the tragedy of that day. We also know, however, that in the wake of that, Rudy Giuliani has done an awful lot to destroy his reputation that was otherwise in fairly good shape, if not spectacular shape, in the wake of his service to the federal government, to the city of New York, and I would offer also to the people of the United States of America. Since that time, he has offered his own advice, his counsel, his direction to the now former president. He oversaw, for example, President Trump's legal challenges to the 2020 election, making persistent claims that the voting had been marred by widespread cheating, irregularities, a series of informal legislative hearings, you may recall, in key swing states around the country, going around the country saying that, in fact, the 2020 election had been stolen. Baseless conspiracy theories that a cabal of international actors had hacked into voting machines produced by a group called Dominion Voting Systems. They have turned around and sued Rudy Giuliani for those statements, also alleging defamation, all kinds of things that he has done, as you know well. Well, just this past week, we learned for the first time that back in November, the United States Attorney's Office in the District of Columbia served a subpoena, a grand jury, a criminal subpoena on Rudy Giuliani. And we know, of course, that this predates the appointment of Jack Smith, the special counsel for the January 6th matter, also the Mar-a-Lago matter. And so we know, again, that at some point in the not-too-distant past, Rudy Giuliani is also now the subject, if not the target, of the grand jury, the federal grand jury, summoning him there to provide testimony. The significance of that is that this is the first time that evidence has surfaced suggesting that Mr. Giuliani himself is directly embroiled in this inquiry into the part that Donald Trump played in the events leading up to January 6th. More particularly, it appears from reading some tea leaves here that as a part of this investigation, again being pursued by the Department of Justice through the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Columbia, that the special counsel's office is examining this group called the Save America Pac, among other things, the inner workings of Donald Trump's fundraising vehicle, the Save America Pac. The records subpoenaed from Mr. Giuliani could potentially include some related to payments made by that PAC, according to some people who have provided some information to some journalists out there. We know as well that some subpoenas issued in the past several months have asked for records concerning Save America. The House committee that investigated the January 6th matter also looked at that. And so, again, significant information that this continues to be the focus, a federal focus, a criminal focus, targeting documents that Mr. Giuliani has. We're going to talk more about that and other matters right after this break.
Hey, this is Matt from Design Garden. Remember when the internet was new? Back then you had to leave your house to start a business. Companies used to pay programmers bags of cash to get online. Now, small businesses can get online with a Facebook business page, or Squarespace, or Google My Business, or WordPress. But which tools should you use? Can you afford to go down the wrong path? Design Garden uses modern tools to build your website the right way. Find us online at design.garden. Again, that's design.garden.
Hey, this is Jim Santel. I am the host of Morning Cannolis. Every single Saturday morning from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m., we talk about the major stories in law, in government, and the aspiration for justice in America. Delighted to have you join, call in, and be a part of our discussion right here on the networks of Civic Media.
You've got questions about navigating the healthcare system? Kristen Lyerly helps us find answers and discusses other issues at the intersection of healthcare and politics. Hometown Health, Thursday mornings at 7:30 on Up North News Radio.
Fear you may be missing out? We're always streaming on TuneIn and the Civic Media app. Enjoy listening live or catch up by finding the podcast at civicmedia.us or wherever you enjoy listening to your podcasts.
Here's your updated forecast on the Shaw. Sunshine mixed with clouds at times this afternoon, with daytime highs approaching 33. Southwest winds 5 to 10 miles an hour. 27 tonight, mainly cloudy skies expected. Partly cloudy tomorrow, highs around 40. 44 Monday, with a chance for scattered rain showers. 41 Tuesday, chance for showers continues. For Civic Media, I'm meteorologist Eric Height. Currently, it's 21 degrees.
The Shaw.
And we are back, and my name is Jim Santel. This is Morning Cannolis. We're talking once again about issues related to law, government, and justice in America. Right before the break, taking this very important phone call from Jake, who was commenting about this event, now described in the media, a 6-year-old shooting his teacher, and commenting about the possibility of prosecution against parents for failing not only to keep guns in their home in a safe and a secure mechanism, a safe and secure situation, so their 6-year-old, for example, does not get a hold of it. That has got to be a part of any rational response, not only to these kinds of events, but also to ensure that our Second Amendment rights, while they are established by the Constitution now, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, still ensure that we are safe and secure. Again, every major thoughtful advocate with respect to the Second Amendment understands and appreciates and embraces this notion that safety at the home, keeping guns out of the hands of children, is a key component of, again, many of these rational and reasonable regulations that can be imposed. When that fails to happen, prosecutors should and do on a regular basis take a look at the responsibility of the adult for that behavior of their young person, their minor child. And so we'll look forward. We'll see what happens in that particular case. Again, very much appreciating the comment Jake made about that particular incident, having to do, once again, with the enforcement of the rule of law in America. We're taking another caller right now. Dick, so glad to have you with us this morning on Morning Cannolis, calling in from Madison. Thanks, Dick, for your comment or your question.
Well, I hate to say what I'm going to say, but I'm going to say it. I've thought a lot about January 6th and all of the rest that happened over the last couple of years, and I can't help but think that if the majority of those people would have been people of color, you would have seen much stronger sentences, much faster through the system, so to speak. And proof of it, I listened to Reverend Sharpton talking about just having to get a permit for a demonstration for Black Lives Matter and all the hoops they had to jump through. And yet this group with guns hanging out, sitting within blocks of the area in trees with weapons, and on and on and on it goes. But I'm sorry. And the way the former guy, too, cleared the street early that year in June, just everything that went on is just...
Right, as he was going over to Lafayette Square, right, and clearing away the protesters. Once again, from my perspective, violating the First Amendment rights of people to protest and people to assemble. That's part of our Constitution, too. That, very offensive at the time. Go beyond that. Dick, to your very good point here, that the incitement, again, a part of this overall plan, not only to undermine our election, but one does pause when one thinks about the response, if you will, to what happened on that day. If there had been people of color on that day who had been attacking our Capitol in a much greater population than they were, one cannot help but wonder if the response, frankly, not only politically, but even by law enforcement, may not have been different than it was. So very much appreciate your comment. We are going to look forward to further examination of those kinds of important issues. Dick, very much appreciate your observation about that. The frustration of the inequitable application of the rule of law in America, and that justice, although it is imperfect, is also the best justice system we have, also somewhat slow, as you indicated, Dick, in terms of getting all of this remedied and addressed. Let's talk about a couple of other things that are moving ahead, but also not with great speed. Again, in connection with the January 6th event, we know that the January 6th committee has subpoenaed many people, including among them Steve Bannon, the former senior advisor to the president. He has been convicted of 2 counts of contempt of Congress. We know that the January 6th committee also subpoenaed Mark Meadows, the former chief of staff. The United States Department of Justice has declined to prosecute him, based in part upon the fact that he did comply, at least in some part, with the request of the House committee for documents, and then kind of withdrew that support. Nonetheless, a declination there. But there's a third person out there, Peter Navarro. Peter Navarro, also a major senior advisor to the former president, also charged with contempt by the United States Department of Justice based upon a referral of the House committee. His trial was set to go back in November, but Judge Ahmed Mehta, we talked about him a little bit in the first hour this morning, was obliged to postpone that lawsuit, that prosecution against Peter Navarro for contempt of Congress from November until this coming week, January 11th. Peter Navarro undergoing trial now for contempt of Congress. He is the third person subject to a referral for contempt of Congress. Again, Steve Bannon previously charged and convicted. Mark Meadows declined. And now Peter Navarro going ahead in front of Judge Mehta and a jury that he will bring together on 2 counts of ignoring that subpoena based upon his involvement in the January 6th attack. And so, again, all of that related to January 6th, both directly and derivatively. We also have another caller calling in from Rock County. Rico, your comment or question this morning about any of the broad issues that we're discussing here on our broadcast.
Yeah, hey, Jim, I got a question for you. Maybe you could help me out with this. I was wondering, is there a mechanism, a legal route, or, some kind of tool that we the people of Wisconsin have that would enable us, maybe through petition or something of that nature, to demand, and I'm speaking about Ron Johnson here, an investigation and, if necessary, charges or what have you. But initially, the investigation. I'm just wondering, is there a route here? Is there something that we, the people, the voters that were almost disenfranchised, is there a legal route forward on this? And I'll take your answer off here. Thanks a lot.
Sure, Rico. And again, following up in part on a question that Joe asked in our first hour, thank you again for that. Again, this news breaking this past week, coming out of additional transcripts and reporting from the January 6th committee that our senior senator may have been involved in trying to influence the electoral votes through our state legislature. We're going to chat more about Rico's good question and comment right after the break, and we're going to talk more about that in just a moment. We are back. Thank you for staying with me on this Saturday, January 14th, 2023 Here on Morning Cannolis, we're talking about the Proud Boys trial resuming soon in a district court in Washington, D.C., and the significant, seemingly insignificant, but really significant evidentiary ruling by the presiding judge that the statement by, at that point, President Trump, candidate Trump, Proud Boys stand back and stand by in the response given to him by the leader of the Proud Boys, standing by, sir, that all of that can be introduced as evidence of seditious conspiracy as those charges go forward in the federal district court in Washington, D.C. Why is that significant? Again, it's an evidentiary ruling. It's a part of the overall case. It's not the entire case, but I identify this as significant because of this. A jury in America is about to be presented in the coming days and weeks with evidence that a sitting president of the United States of America expressly motivated, encouraged, urged, and indeed maybe even incited a white supremacist national organization, those are the Proud Boys, to stand by, to prepare to violently interfere, to overthrow the peaceful transfer of presidential power. That is a significant matter. That is the implicit, if not explicit, finding in this evidentiary ruling coming out of the federal district court just this past week. We will certainly continue to monitor that trial, talk more about that in future broadcasts. Recognize as well that there are more Oath Keeper trials also coming up. There are still more trials of a group now approaching 1,000 people for their particular on-site involvement in January 6th. Those prosecutions, those sentencings continue on a regular basis in 2023. And then, of course, as we know, based upon what we've discussed this morning and in other broadcasts, the larger focus on who designed all this, who put it all together. Was the former president himself, the president at that time, responsible for, as Liz Cheney said, lighting the match that caused all this to happen? What about other people, like people like the former leadership of the Department of Justice, the Associate Attorney General, who was almost named the Attorney General by the former president, a fellow named Jeff Clark? What about people like Rudy Giuliani? What about people like John Eastman, who crafted this overall scheme? Others involved. That the focus plainly of Jack Smith, who's looking at the overall determination of whether or not there are people who are responsible at the highest levels for causing January 6th. We'll continue to monitor that and talk more about all of that as well. And in that connection, in connection with riots at the location of legislative activity, we'll look south for a little while to Brazil. You know well that just this past Sunday, a mob stormed the nation's halls of power, of legislation in Brazil. And just this past week, as a result of that, Brazil's Supreme Court, a different system than the one that we have here, Brazil's Supreme Court says it's going to investigate the former president, Jair Bolsonaro, for inspiring the far-right mob in Brazil that invaded and ransacked that country's Congress just earlier this week. The Supreme Court and presidential offices were also overtaken by that mob, and the decision just yesterday by a Supreme Court justice, his name is Alexandre de Moraes, approved a request from federal prosecutors, again in Brazil, to include the former president, Jair Bolsonaro, in this expanding investigation into the anti-democratic riots that happened on January 8th. Sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? Probably inspired by what happened in our country in January 6th, 2 years earlier. But the decision obviously illustrates this very aggressive approach that Brazilian authorities have taken in response to those riots, quickly arresting about 1,000 rioters there. And beyond this, again, the Supreme Court, in a system, again, different than ours, through this Associate Justice, Supreme Court Justice de Moraes, making this finding that the investigation should include any attempts by the former president to stir this up and to cause it in the first place. Very little question probably out there in the public domain that Bolsonaro inspired about 5,000 people who were at that protest that turned very violent this past Sunday. They carried signs, for example, again, in the public domain that referenced conspiracy theories about Brazil's electronic voting machines. Again, sounds very familiar to what happened here in America, right? Mr. Bolsonaro had long peddled these theories that the election itself was the result of fraud, and that his political rivals in that, including the successful president now having taken office, were guilty themselves of fraud. That, however, is similar. It's also different. Bolsonaro's post-election actions contrast those of our former president, Donald Trump. Bolsonaro largely stepped into the shadows since losing the October election, and as you well know from reports, has recently suggested that his followers actually move on. He sent some of those messages, and most recently, he departed for Florida, where he is today, the subject of some inquiries of the State Department about how the former president of Brazil ended up in Florida. Some significant differences in what happened after these riots of just this past Sunday. Bolsonaro somewhat different from Donald Trump. Nonetheless, doing an awful lot of things prior to that time to stir up the tumult, to cause the riots. Now, as here in America, all of that, the focus of an investigation by criminal prosecutors in Brazil about the involvement of the now former President Bolsonaro into events leading up to the tumult of just this past Sunday at the Congress and the other legislative and executive offices there in Brasilia. Continuing to monitor that as well. History being lived in reality, in the moment, both in the United States of America, but also around the world. And finally, as we go into our final moments here and segments here on our morning broadcast, I promise we're going to talk again about the Supreme Court. We spent an awful lot of time, I think appropriately last year, talking about the United States Supreme Court, things on its docket, and we will spend a lot of time, probably in May and June, talking about some of the major decisions, 10, 12, maybe 15 different decisions the Supreme Court will be issuing on a variety of different issues, including things like the Voting Rights Act, including on the authority of state legislatures to decide voting results, including environmental laws and many, many other issues that we discussed in the past. The Supreme Court has continued to be, in 2023, active on the bench and off the bench as well. Let's talk about at least two, if not three, things that happened just this past week coming out of the Supreme Court docket. We know it continues to entertain oral argument. It's approaching right now about 60 cases overall that it has taken under its wing to review. And it also is making decisions about those cases that it will not review, that it has decided not to grant certiorari, not to ask for the lower court to send the record up, not going to be reviewing those lower court cases. One of those cases comes in the wake of a major case that was decided by the United States Supreme Court last year. This major case having to do with firearms and the Second Amendment in particular. You may recall well that in a case called New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, the High Court, last summer struck down New York's prior concealed carry gun law. About a 6-3 majority vote said that the law prevented law-abiding citizens with ordinary self-defense needs, that's the language of the Supreme Court, from exercising their Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms in the public for self-defense. And just days after that ruling, striking down the New York law, the governor of New York, a woman named Kathy Hochul, you've seen her a lot on television and the media generally, convened a special session to pass a new law. This is called the Concealed Carry Improvement Act, and she did that on July 1. The legislature there in New York did that on July 1. The New York law, however, again, in the wake of Bruin, came under immediate scrutiny, immediate attack, as gun owners said that it was in direct defiance of the Supreme Court ruling under Bruin and promised that they would take this up on appeal. And sure enough, in the wake of Kathy Hochul's convening this extraordinary legislative session, she said, to combat a gun violence crisis, what happened was that this matter then got appealed, got brought into the district court there, a district court in Syracuse, New York. And a judge named Glenn Sotheby blocked many aspects of the new New York law, 184-page opinion. he issued back in November. It sort of drew, if you will, on the methodology of Bruen that was decided by the Supreme Court and struck down this new law that Kathy Hochul and the New York legislature had implemented. Said that specifically that the new law's good moral character requirement, along with some other disclosures that were called for by the law, including the identification of family members and some social media accounts, all of that, he said, violative of Bruen, violative of the Constitution. Also halted the law's restrictions on carrying guns, among other places, in places of worship, public parks, zoos, buses, theaters, and establishments serving alcohol. So a huge defeat, if you will, in New York for this newly enacted law in the wake of Bruen. Well, what happens after that? A unanimous 3-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals in the Second Circuit, that is the circuit court responsible for overseeing district courts in that area, put Judge Sotheby's ruling on hold and said, nope, don't go ahead. Do not stop the implementation of New York's law. A lot of double negatives there. So the Court of Appeals basically reinstitutes the Kathy Hochul and legislative law, permits it to go ahead while the appeal, the substantive appeal, goes forward before the Second Circuit. And then what happened, prompting the news of just this past week? The plaintiffs in this case, again, challenging the new New York law, brought the entire matter to the Supreme Court. And said in particular that the good moral character requirement of the new law is no less subject, they said in their pleadings, to the unbridled discretion of licensing officials and makes the licensing process even more difficult than it was before. And this ban on guns in sensitive places, they went on to say, encompasses almost the entire state, designed the allegations in their appeal to the Supreme Court, not as a public safety measure, but rather as a political statement demonstrating New York's contempt for this court's decision in Bruen. Those, again, the allegations made by those people seeking to have the New York law overturned. And so this comes to the Supreme Court. And just this past week, the Supreme Court on Wednesday of this past week, issued a brief unsigned order, no reasons behind it, don't have to do that allowed New York to enforce, for now, this new law placing strict limits on guns outside the home that was enacted, again, in response to this landmark ruling in June under Bruen. So the Supreme Court, a majority of the Supreme Court members say the New York law can continue to be in place, not with any specific statements justifying that. However, even as the Supreme Court permits that to go ahead, their basis, presumably, in this is that at some point, the Court of Appeals, again, the Second Circuit, now reviewing all of this coming out of New York, they will issue a decision. And plainly, the Supreme Court invited, if you will, an appeal of that decision from the lower court to the Supreme Court on the substance of all of this. Basically, the Supreme Court saying this past week, let the lower court decide this, and then we'll take it up after that if you choose to appeal it. Significantly, however, along the way, 2 justices of the Supreme Court, not surprisingly, Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas was the one who wrote Bruen, said that the law presents novel and serious questions. That is this new New York law. Plainly, again, inviting this appeal. Added that the appeals court should address those questions first and should do it promptly. And again, statements made by these 2 kind of addendums, if you will, to the brief unsigned orders saying, we're not giving you any ruling on the substance. We're letting the lower court of appeals decide this case first. And after that, we will take a look at that. And also affirming, once again, that lower courts generally should take a close look at Bruen and the opinion written by Clarence Thomas for the majority in deciding on the legitimacy of other gun laws out there. Significant statement by the Supreme Court just this past week. We'll hear more about guns down the road from the Supreme Court. And right to the break, a couple of more cases pending in front of the Supreme Court, some action before them just this past week. Stay with us for some reporting on those cases too. We are back for our final segment this morning on Morning Cannolis. Always delighted to take your comments and questions. We're talking about many different things this morning, including some state court prosecutions out there as well. We'll get back to those in just a moment or so. But Tom from Cedarburg calling in. Appreciate your comment or question as well. Thanks, Tom.
Hi. I just want to say, Jim, I think you have a great show, and it's really fitting for the times we're living in to hear some accurate information on what's really happening and why it's happening and stuff. I'd also like to say, too, that you have some really good people calling in, and I'd like to point out especially the gal named Joel. She seems really articulate and intelligent. I'd like to see someone like that run for office or something and be able to represent us.
Absolutely, Tom. I appreciate your comments about the program. We try to do our best here to be somewhat apolitical, not always successful in doing that, but most importantly, focusing on civics, right? As you just said, talking about what's really going on out there, accurate information. We can disagree, you and I can, and others can, based upon what we should do, but gosh, we've got to have a basic understanding of civics. We've got to have a basic understanding of what did, in fact, happen out there. So appreciate that comment. And yes, concur in your views and also the views of people like Joe and others who've called in. All good folks out there who are giving this some serious thought, being balanced and reasonable and rational. So appreciate that very much. Absolutely. Tom, thanks for calling in this morning. Appreciate that, Tom. And we'll look forward to more callers down the road, not only in future casts, but also this morning if we still have an opportunity to do just that. I promised at the outset that we would talk about a couple of other matters that have been also in the news this past week. You recall as well that on Christmas Day, some power substations in Washington State were attacked. And specifically, those power stations in Tacoma, Washington, thousands were left without power after some vandals forced their way into 4 substations, damaged some equipment there, leading to a fire in one instance. 14,000 people over the holidays were left without power from those attacks. Substations owned by the Tacoma Public Utilities and Puget Sound Energy Corporation. Well, just this past week, there were 2 individuals who were charged with those attacks. Their names are Matthew Greenwood and Jeremy Cahan. They've been charged with conspiracy once again, to damage energy facilities. And Greenwood faces a separate charge of possessing illegal short-barreled rifles. Again, a gun charge related to his attack, along with that of Cahan, on this energy facility. They apparently plotted to knock out power from 4 different substations. Power in those first 2 facilities was in fact out. The pair then broke into a local business to steal from the cash register, and all of this being provided after Greenwood himself was arrested along with Cahan. Again, the reason why that's significant is not only for what happened in Washington, but this, again, continuing notion that this is now an appropriate thing to do. We know that law enforcement agencies are investigating at least 8 other similar attacks on power stations in 4 states just in this past month alone, including in North Carolina. And we recall well that in the late fall of last year, too. Investigations underway by, again, local authorities, the FBI as well, to address this latest attempt, if you will, to shut down our nation by attacking our power sources. Again, hopefully the deterrent lesson here is you will get arrested, you will get charged, presumably get convicted and sentenced for doing this. Again, an attempt to undermine the very way in which we live in America. Finally, as we go forward here in our last moments, wanted to comment about the fact that we had a major sentencing this past week of Rick Singer. He was the mastermind of this sprawling college admissions scam, known kind of colloquially as Varsity Blues. He was sentenced this past Wednesday to 3.5 years in federal prison. And that was the longest sentence in a case that, of course, has rattled and really disturbed America's education system. He was the central figure, you may recall, in this scam involving wealthy parents who were, if you will, desperate to get their children into some elite universities. Huge sums of money to cheat on standardized tests, bribe university coaches, do other things, including sports falsifications. Singer pled guilty to racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, conspiracy to defraud the U.S., and obstruction of justice way back in March of 2019. He did, in fact, cooperate. He cooperated with the government's investigation in the months prior to the public announcement of the case, and in the years since. We know well that that prosecution, that investigation, brought into its ambit, quite literally, about 50 people who were charged and arrested, including some of those coaches, including some test administrators, including some prominent CEOs of businesses out there, and yes, the actresses Felicity Huffman and Lori Loughlin. During his sentencing this past week, the defendant said, "I lost my ethical values and have so much to regret. To be frank, I'm ashamed of myself." Well, probably true of all of the other defendants as well. We've talked a lot about deterrence on this broadcast. Deterrence about other people who engage in this kind of activity, not only to stop them, the individuals like Mr. Singer, William Rick Singer, again sentenced this past week to 3.5 years, but also those people who engage in academic fraud, and yes, broadly, other kinds of fraud that might be out there. That's the purpose behind prosecution, to stop the individuals and also send the appropriate messages out there about other people who might be thinking about doing the same kind of thing. Finally, in our last moments together here, about 2 minutes or so, wanted to return to an issue that we have talked a lot about, and we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about it in the future weeks here in 2023, and that is the United States Supreme Court. I made reference already to this Moore versus Harper case, this fringe doctrine involving the independent state legislature doctrine, the notion that somehow our legislatures should be the one who make decisions about electoral votes and other things when it comes to voting in America. Well, this coming week, the Supreme Court back in session once again. January 9th, which is Monday, Tuesday the 10th, Wednesday, a number of different cases. On Monday, have a case they're going to be taking oral argument on communications, both legal and non-legal, having to do with the attorney-client privilege. That coming up on Monday. Also on Monday, the Ohio National Guard, it attempted to end a collective bargaining agreement with employees, whether they violated federal law in doing that. That's coming up on Monday. Tuesday, an issue involving the National Labor Relations Act and whether it's preempted, and its access to justice, if you will, is preempted by a state court claim for destroying employers' property in a labor dispute. Finally, on Wednesday, an 11th Amendment case involving the Economic Stability Act in Puerto Rico, having to do with its sovereign immunity, territorial claims there as well. 4 major cases coming up in the Supreme Court in this coming week. We'll be talking about that and more in those future weeks. Join us again every Saturday morning here at Morning Cannolis. Thank you for being with me and with my producer, Calvin. We'll look forward to hearing from you again next Saturday here on the studios of Civic Media.